And Victoria's Premier is warning more suburbs in and around Melbourne could go back into lockdown if cases of COVID-19 remain high. That's after 10 postcodes across more than 35 suburbs were put back under tight restrictions just before midnight Wednesday, meaning residents in those areas are only able to leave home to exercise or work, buy essential items and to access child or health care. Melissa Davey is the Melbourne Bureau Chief for The Guardian and lives in one of the so-called ring-fenced suburbs. She says authorities are relying on a very heavy police presence to encourage compliance, and some people are finding that upsetting.
One of the most significant ways it's been enforced here across the some 30 suburbs where it's taken effect is through a very heavy police presence. And some suburbs are seeing a more stringent police presence than others. So as you drive into some of the suburbs, there are police checkpoints where there are police vehicles and police officers stopping motorists as they come through. And they're asking to see ID and asking for the reason for travel. There are only 4 reasons why people in these hotspot suburbs are allowed to travel, and that's for work and education, and even then, only if work and education can't be done from home. It's for medical care, it's for essential services like food and groceries and that kind of thing. And then you can also go outside of your home for exercise, but you can't get in the car and travel to, say, a gym or something like that. So short of those reasons, you're just not allowed to leave your suburb, and people from outside the suburbs aren't allowed in. We've also heard reports of drones being used by police to monitor people. We've heard reports of licence checks being carried out to trace people back to their suburb and to check where they are registered. So there's a wide variety of ways this is being enforced. Of course, there are really hundreds of different access points to suburbs, though, when you consider access by foot or by cycle paths or by roads. So police seem to be focusing on just a few key areas at the moment.
So is there any suggestion that some people have tried to skip out of those suburbs that you knew were going into lockdown, and even, obviously, because you've got close borders there, getting over the border into another state?
There have been some reports of that. It's not widespread from the data so far, and we're only a few days into this lockdown. But we've also had reports that people are trying to change the address on their driver's licence to different suburbs, and they were trying to do that in the 24 hours between the lockdown being announced and being enforced. So there have been people attempting that. And yes, a couple of people have travelled to other states, one person by train into New South Wales. So there have been a couple of cases of that, but largely people have been compliant. I was speaking to a police officer at a checkpoint yesterday, and he was saying that mostly people were travelling for work, which is a legitimate reason for travel.
Is there any suggestion, given that you are still getting these big numbers of new cases, that they will spread the lockdown and even return the entire Melbourne area into tighter restrictions?
So the Premier of Victoria, Daniel Andrews, has made it clear that that will be an option if we do see increased spread. It's certainly something they'll consider. It's not really on the table yet. So although we had 66 cases announced overnight, it's similar to the numbers we've seen over the last couple of days, and the rate of community transmission has remained consistent. So that's a good sign that the government is talking about, but it just depends on what happens over the next couple of days. I mean, especially over the weekend. So what we've seen is a real ramped up effort to test people in these hotspot suburbs. We have hundreds of public health staff on the streets just patrolling, knocking on doors, offering tests and giving people test kits. So with so many tests being carried out, it's not unusual to see a spike in cases. And over the weekend, a lot of that data will be put together, and we'll know next week how we're looking and whether more widespread lockdowns are needed.
So you are in Brunswick, right, which is one of the areas locked down. But I understand that in some suburbs and postcodes, there's sort of idiosyncrasies where kind of if you're on one side of the street, you're in the lockdown. If you're on the other, you're not. And some situations where the school your kids go to might be just out of the lockdown or just inside it. Is there anything like that where you are?
Yeah, so I'm in Brunswick West, so that's right next to Brunswick. And Brunswick is not in lockdown, but Brunswick West, where I am, is in lockdown. And yes, there are examples of a pub on one side of the street being not in a hotspot location, it's open, but someone living on the other side of the street can't go because they're in a hotspot location. So there is some of that. I've seen in my suburb less police checkpoints and more just police on foot patrol, walking around, checking on people. But in other suburbs where there's more of a concern about community transmission, the police presence has been quite a lot heavier. It's a strange thing because, at the beginning of this pandemic, there was a sense that all Australians were in it together. We were all in lockdown and going through similar. But now we have a case where parts of Victoria and a lot of other states and territories around Australia are opening up and people are planning for school holidays, they're going away, they're seeing their friends again. And yet people in these suburbs that are under lockdown are having a very different experience right now. And it's a significant number of people affected. It's, I think, about 300,000 people at least affected by these lockdowns.
Wow, that's got to be frustrating. You're on one side of the road from the pub and you can see everyone else going, but you can't go across for a beer. That's a bit rough.
Exactly. Look, I think most people understand that this is just the new normal and there will be cases like this, perhaps all around the world, where suburbs or areas go back into lockdown. I think what's really important is the government messaging around it. Some of this police response, some of the government messaging, it's really kind of upsetting people because there's a sense that we've done something wrong when in fact that's really not the case.
And that is Melissa Davey, and she's the Melbourne Bureau Chief for The Guardian newspaper.